Hey, Mari. How's it going? Getting some lunch. That's good.
It's a smoothie bowl.
Oh, nice. What you got in there?
It's got like strawberries and cocoa nibs and granola and stuff.
Sounds good. Did you get some lunch there, Becca?
It's only 12 here and I usually eat around 1 or 2, so
Okay.
I got a couple hours.
Well, at least we're not eating Middlebrook food. There's a whole bunch of parts to this camp that are not as fun as normal, and I miss all those things, but Middlebrook food is not one of the things that I miss.
I swear I lost 5 pounds last year from eating that food.
From walking extra distance and eating Middlebrook junk. Or from more importantly, not eating Middlebrook junk. Okay, so what we're going to do today is we're going to pick up where we left off in the discussion of minimalism, and we're going to go a little bit more toward what we might call post-minimalism. So just to review, I would like some people to tell me kind of the backdrop for minimalism. How did it come about, and what was the idea that we discussed yesterday in terms of like the thought process that brought it on? Do you guys remember? Anybody want to comment on that?
It was a reaction to the Second Viennese school, like Schoenberg and his followers.
Okay.
Which was very chromatic. And so I believe the school of minimalism was a reaction to that, to sort of try to make music more accessible.
Okay, very good. Now, Schoenberg and the Second Viennese school, they were closer to the first part of the 20th century, and minimalism didn't come along until much later, but there is a movement in the 20th century called modernism. Of course, we know modernism has a part in our culture broadly, but in music, it was the idea that music needed to be ultra complex and based on mathematical relationships like serialism. And so it pushed toward the complexity and the avant-garde. And as Mandy said, it definitely lent itself toward things that were hard for the listener. And minimalism was a reaction against that. So that's good. What about the philosophy and the feeling of minimalism itself? Do you remember some of the associations that we made in sort of the attitude of the minimalists? I said it at the very end of class yesterday, and I had to go quickly through it. Here's your clue. Hum.
Meditation?
That's right. So it has strong connections to Eastern religion and meditation, which you can imagine would be the case for something that's very repetitive, that just sort of brings the fast, intense, always changing thought process. It just brings it down a level and it slows everything down. So there is that connection to especially the early versions of minimalism. What were some of the names of the composers we looked at yesterday? Anyone?
Steve Reich?
Steve Reich or Steve Reich, yes. Who else? What do you think, Florence? Can you remember name of a composer we talked about yesterday besides Steve Reich? How about Josiah? What were some of the other names we went over?
Oh, I wasn't here last session.
Or you weren't? Becca?
I know we mentioned John Adams, and then at the end you said Lamont Young, Philip Glass, and Terry Riley.
Nice work. Becca took notes. Way to go, Becca. Yeah. So what we call the New York School of Minimalism included Lamont Young, Steve Reich, Terry Riley, and Philip Glass. Those guys are commonly known as the New York School. And then today we're going to talk about some of the later usages of minimalism. Did you want to add something to that, Becca? Okay, looked like you were going to say something. All right, so let's keep going. And I'm going to start by playing you some music by John Adams. And I want you to notice the difference in Adams' music. Now, I think most of you have probably heard the music of John Adams before, so I don't think that this is necessarily the first time for a lot of you. But do you remember when we first started listening to some of Steve Reich's music, we were listening to patterns that we called phase patterns, and it seemed like they went on for a long, long time before anything changed. It felt, you could hear the process, and we talked about what that process was, but it felt like the process was very slow. And depending on the piece, it can be exceedingly slow. But in this case, what I want you to notice is that there's still lots of repetition, but the process is such that things change more rapidly. It's like we don't have to wait quite as long for something to change. So the name of the piece, and I will type this in the chat like I did yesterday, this is John Adams, and I'm gonna play you a piece called Hallelujah Junction. Anybody heard of this piece before? This is for piano duet. And this is one of my very favorite John Adams pieces, actually. Here's the first movement. Now we are 1 minute and 4 seconds in to this piece. And how many times do you suppose the pattern changed in 1 minute and 4 seconds? Take it, just throw out an estimate. How many times about? Was there a little sort of micro level change introduced in the pattern? Any idea? I'll give you a hint. It wasn't 1 and it wasn't 100. Something in between. What do you think? 10 or 12 probably? Probably 10 or probably a dozen or more little changes. Listen for the very first one. I'm going to start at the beginning again. So by the 5th time we heard ba-dum-bum, ba-dum-bum. By number 5, we already had a change, and that was about 3 or 4 seconds in. And you had those little micro level changes happening all the time. So it's like you have this musical object that's just morphing very slowly. Again, we used the analogy yesterday of a kaleidoscope where you're turning the dial and the shape you see changes, but it's like now you're turning it a lot quicker. And I think most people hear this music as minimalistic, but it's not so hard or abrasive or annoying. And I'm not going to say Steve Reich's music is annoying, because I really like a lot of it, but sometimes minimalism can drive you nuts because it literally feels like it's not changing for a long, long, long time. And John Adams' music tends to change a lot quicker. John Adams has actually said that he doesn't even prefer to be called a minimalist because he doesn't think of himself that way. But I think we can hear the correlations, at least, regardless of what we actually label him to be.
I found it much more accessible.
What's that?
I found it much more accessible.
Right. And I think a lot of people agree with you. The piece I played for you yesterday in the salon when I was talking about minimalism was John Adams' Chairman Dances. I mean, it sounds like this. And once again, it's about every 4 or 5 repetitions of whatever it is that's going on. It happens 4 or 5 times, and then another layer is added. Okay, so that is John Adams, and there's lots of interesting pieces by John Adams that you should know about. He wrote a lot of cool stuff. There's lots of his music I like, and if you study John Adams' music, you'll come up with a number of pieces that I wasn't able to mention here today, but that are really attractive pieces. Short Ride in a Fast Machine is a 4-minute piece, fanfare for orchestra. Sounds like this. And so on. So you should check out, I'll type it here, Short Ride in a Fast Machine, also by John Adams. Now going back to that Hallelujah Junction piece, it strikes me, as it may have struck you, that music like this is often used in film scoring. It's really common for film score composers, and name one, you have Hans Zimmer, who does this kind of thing a lot, and other composers, to have a somewhat simple and repetitive pattern. I'm going to play the beginning of that piece for you, and I want you to imagine a film scoring scene. Let's just say it's kind of a static scene. Somebody's taking a long walk on the beach, or somebody's driving their car through London on a rainy day or something. Imagine hearing this kind of music with a scene where you want steady movement, but you don't want anything too intense. It's just a very steady flowing texture. So one of the things that you notice about minimalism, and actually film scoring music, is that often it lacks a really obvious foreground that we might think of as a melody. A lot of times it's sort of like an accompaniment that lacks melodic content. And that's the exact thing that you're looking for in a film, because of course you don't always want a melody to be front and center, kind of taking over everything, because the picture is front and center. And so it works really well to use minimalistic techniques as a sort of backdrop for something like a film. It's not that all film music is minimalist, and it's certainly not that all minimalism would be good for film, but there is a correlation there. And if you listen to Hans Zimmer, sometimes colleagues and I will joke about Hans Zimmer's music, that all of it sounds like dun, 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 dun. You listen to about 2 minutes of Batman, and you've heard the whole film score pretty much. And I'm not ripping on him in the sense that it's very effective film scoring music, but a lot of times it's repetitive patterns that don't have a lot of melodic content. And so there is a correlation there with minimalism. So I want to transition to some other things that would be classified as post-minimalist. And for this, I'm going to bring up a YouTube link of a piece that I really like. And the composer's name, let me bring it up real quick.
Disney Plus, Hulu.
Okay. So let's share my screen here. This is a piece, here I'll type the composer's name. The composer's name is Michael Torke, Torke, and the name of the piece is Mojave. And this is a concerto for marimba, and it's played sometimes by orchestra, sometimes by wind band. I would not recommend writing your marimba music to be this difficult this week, but this is a really fun piece, and what I want you to notice is that he's using a lot of repetitive patterns, but like John Adams, the patterns change more frequently. It's like minimalism, except it doesn't require quite as much repetition on the part of the listener to just sit and sort of labor through patterns. Everything just changes more often. And so it's a lot more conducive to a lot of concert settings. And I really like the music of Torke. So I'm going to share my screen. And then let's bring up this video for you. Okay, so I'm going to stop it there. So could you guys hear that okay? Hopefully the sound quality was passably good. Feel free to go back and check these things later if you want to hear them better. But that's a really attractive piece that's easy and I would say accessible in most concert settings. Another piece by Torke that I like is a piece called Javelin, which is an orchestra piece that he wrote for the Atlanta Olympics back in '96, I believe. Here's a piece called July, and this is for saxophone quartet. Okay, so let's talk more now about the actual composition procedure. I don't want to just be like the DJ here playing music for you, but I want to be able to understand how it's put together. How do you create a musical object that morphs like that? There's a few different ways. One example that helps us understand a little bit better, for just a second, I'm gonna go back to John Adams, because this is one of the kind of prototypes for how to create some forms of minimalism. Here's a piece by Adams called Phrygian Gates, and this is for piano. Can you guys hear that? It's a little quiet. I'm gonna do a poor man's version of it on my piano here in the office, okay? So we have a repeated E, and he just repeats this E several times, and then he adds the F sharp. And then he adds the octave. So now we're hearing these three pitches. And then he keeps the E and the F sharp and he adds the B. And he adds the D sharp below the E. So it's almost like he has a chord progression that's changing one note at a time. Now you can imagine all the different places you go with that. You alter one pitch at a time, and it's like this thing that's shifting and changing very slowly over time. And it's not a terribly difficult thing to do compositionally. I think carrying out the entire process is a skill that you have to take time to learn, like anything else. But that idea of morphing musical objects is a very important one for minimalism. Let me show you now another video. And this is by a different composer. We haven't talked about him yet. The name of this composer is Max Richter. And I would assume that some of you may have heard of Max Richter before. I'm gonna bring up a text. So this piece is called Maria. And it's a poem that was written by a poet named Marina, I'm trying to say her name. I'll let you guys read her name. How about that? So I'm going to share my screen and you guys can see what I'm looking at. So here's what we're gonna do. We have this poem, Maria Vitova. And we have the poem in a different language, but I want you to take a minute and read the poem in English. Okay, did you make it through? So now that we're all sufficiently depressed, which wasn't necessarily the goal, what I want you to notice now is how Max Richter sets the text. And it's a very simple setting, but I think it brings on some really interesting emotional colors. And so we're gonna watch this video, and I don't think the lyrics, I should say the poem, I don't think the poem is actually on the video, but you've read it now and you get the gist of it.
Уж сколько их упало в эту бездну, до звезд перетонит. Настанет день, когда и я исчезну с поверхности. Застынет все, что первый дорог сияло и зелень глаз, и нежный голос, и сон. Будет жизнь с ее насущным хлебом, и забывчивостью их, и будет все, как никогда не было. Сменчивый, как дети в каждый миг, и так недолго злой, любивший час, когда трава в становится зелена, ранчей и фалькады в чаще, и такой живой, как настоящий. В чем из нашей мира, чужие и свои, я возвращаюсь с светом, и слез, и день, и ночь, и письма, и устья, за правду, да, за то, что мне так часто слишком грустно, и только 20 лет, за то, что мне прямая неизбежность, прощение, за всю мою бессудорожную верность и слишком боль, за несправедливые события, за правду, за игру послушать.
Okay, so I'm going to stop it there. So how would you describe the process? What's the very first thing we heard musically? Anyone?
We heard some vocals, right?
Yeah, we
Some, like,
heard
spoken word.
a poem being read. That's true. What was the music that we were hearing at the very beginning? Don't think too hard.
I had a really hard time hearing it.
Okay, it was a little quiet. By the way, the title is, I think it's just Maria. For you. Maria the Poet. He didn't name it Maria because we don't want West Side Story confusion here. Maria The Poet by Richter. Okay, so the first thing we heard was so a lot of this repeating chord progression, and then he started adding a layer to that. What was the layer that he added? Does anybody remember? It was probably 30 seconds to a minute in. What was the layer he added to the chord progression that he had in the strings? Anyone? Awkward silence. What do you think? Look like you're going to say something, Becca or Mari. I'm going to play it again. Here's just the sound file.
Сколько забывчивости дней, и будет все, как будто бы так не было. Изменчивы, как дети в каждый миг, и так недолго злой, любивший час, когда дрова в камине становится заря, виолончель и квалькады чаще, и тонко сидит меня, такой живой и настоящий.
Right there.
Два, семь, что мне, ни в чем не знавший меры,
What did he
чужой
add?
и своим, я возвращаюсь.
What do you think, Jonas? What did he add?
High violin.
Yes. It's actually so he found a register where we didn't have anything yet. It wasn't saturated up there, and he added a nice high ringing violin sound. I'm not sure offhand if it was a harmonic or not, but that register, of course, just soars over everything. And then it continued like that. It got a little bit more full, and it was just after the poem was done being read that he added another layer that was a little more obvious. What was the layer that was more obvious? Anyone? Still had the chord progression going and still had the high ringing sounds, but then the violins started doing something different. And what was that? Anyone remember? How about you remember that line that emerged? Let's find that one. And all of that is still going on over the original chord progression. And so how would someone go about writing this? Obviously, there's more than one way to write a piece, as you guys are demonstrating this week. But how could somebody put together this sort of thing and know that it's all going to work together? Of course, you could just write layers of stuff on top of stuff, but that's not to say that it's going to blend well. What would be a good method to go about writing something like this and know that it's going to work? What do you think? Feel free to answer. There's not even necessarily only one good answer.
Well, I think back to yesterday, I think it was Kevin who said use chords that sound good together, like a C minor and a G minor. Like you could play those together and it wouldn't sound super dissonant. And so perhaps using that same idea for this concept.
Yes, choosing chords that are consonant and that are easy to harmonize with. Some chords are much more, they're much more, what's the word I'm looking for? exclusive in what you can harmonize with. If we look at a normal scale, a diatonic system such as F major, when you get to a dominant 7 that some of you have probably learned about this week in theory class, you have your major minor 7th chord, you've got this tritone that's there, you have the leading tone of the key, you have a little bit of dissonance, you have a chord that is really strongly sending you in a particular direction. And chords like that are actually not as conducive to the kind of thing we're talking about today in class.
I was going to say, oh, sorry.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
I was going to say playing around with modes and like pentatonic scale.
Yep. All of that is absolutely right. Here was the answer necessarily better than what you guys say. To go about this process of layering is to think about writing music that has multiple layers and starting with the most complete version of whatever it is. Write something that has 4 different levels to it that's really thick texturally, and then work backwards. So think about if I wrote a chord progression, then I wrote a moving part in the middle register, then I wrote, let's say, a low string bass pizzicato and a high violin ringing harmonic. And I started with that complete version, which is full registerly and has all the different textures in it. And I say, that's the part, that's what I'm going to work toward. And then back up from that and say, for the first section of the piece, I'm just going to include this part. And then I'm going to add another layer and another layer and eventually work toward this full-fledged version that I actually started by writing. So you kind of reverse engineer it, so to speak. And that's a really nice way of putting together a piece like this. So before I'm done today, I want to play for you music by another composer that you should definitely know about in this discussion of minimalism. And this composer's name, this is an Estonian composer named, anybody want to fill in the blank? Anybody know who I'm talking about? He has written music that is not in the New York school. His music has been called holy minimalism, H-O-L-Y minimalism, because it's very, go ahead, Kevin.
Is it Avro Part?
Yes, it is Arvo Pärt. Very good. Now I'm missing some of the punctuation marks that you find in his name if you look it up on the internet, but that's how you spell it, Arvo Pärt. And he has a number of pieces that are really well known. I'm going to play you a piece.
No insurance?
I'm going to play you a commercial really quick. Okay, let me share this video and you can see some music by Arvo Pärt. Spiegel im Spiegel is the name of the piece. For cello and piano. Okay, so I think you can hear how, like some of the other minimalism, it's pretty slow moving, but in a different way. It doesn't carry a lot of the energy and the fast repetitive rhythms that we found with the New York school.
You're muted and we can't hear what you said.
Let's try that again. Could you hear the music just now? So that is Arvo Pärt, Spiegel im Spiegel. He has a lot
Mirror in the mirror.
of. I actually didn't remember offhand. Is that what Spiegel translates to? Mirror?
I don't know. That's what I was asking.
Oh, okay, I'd have to look it up. I don't remember offhand. Okay, so the last thing I want to do today is show you a piece that I wrote not too long ago. Well, I guess it was a few years ago now, 2011 maybe. Lost track of that actually. I'm going to find the score.
It is mirror.
And I guess what I want to point out for this piece is that in this case, what I wanted to do was use minimalism as a sort of backdrop. I wanted to use it as an accompaniment figure of sorts. And in doing so, I found that it had a lot of energy and it had a lot of good qualities, but it also still let me put a melody line in front of it that served my purposes for this piece. So while I'm going to dig up the score here. Okay, I've got the score. And now I'm going to turn on the share again and point out a couple things. So here's the score, and you'll recognize the tune probably when you hear it. It's a fairly common tune that's been used as a hymn, among other things. But look at these patterns that I have in the woodwinds. Bum bum ba-da-dum, bum bum ba-da-dum, ba-da-dum. You'll hear a lot of that. And then you'll hear me bring it back in other voices. Saxophone here, clarinet, oboe. And then I bring it back in the woodwinds here, but that's while I have other things now going on in the bass voices and in the brass. And it goes on for a little bit, and then I want you to look at some of the pointillistic repetitive textures I have here on page 5. And then I'm going to find the place where the tune is first presented so I can point out a couple things. Okay, now look at the trombone and the tenor saxophone. Here's the tune. E flat. Some of you may have heard that hymn tune before. But now look at what's going on in the other voices while I do that. I have this little pattern here in the clarinet part, and it's being mirrored in other voices as well. And look how I have it presented in clarinet 1, but I have it offset by a few beats in alto saxophone 1. At the same time that I have this other pattern in the woodwinds going on different beats. So in short, what I did was I found a pattern no matter how I had it going. I could have people playing it at all different times in the background, and it still blends with itself because I found a pitch collection that works while I have this tune going on. So to finish off today, I'm going to play this piece for you, and I want you to hear how I have this all put together. So let's find it here in my iTunes somewhere. Okay, here we go. Okay, so I'm going to stop that there. So what I want to point out is, as we said earlier, the fact that when you get a pattern going that just kind of blends and mixes with itself in good ways, no matter how you use it, you have a lot of potential for layering and to take minimalism and use it as a sort of background effect or an accompaniment effect, as opposed to being the sort of repetitive thing that you just hear, you know, for minutes on end and nothing else is going on. So I've tried to give you an overview of different ways to use minimalism, and I've found that it's really fun as a compositional tool, whether you like the original presentations of minimalism that we saw in Reich's music or say Philip Glass or something like that, or if you like more of a post-minimalist style. There's a lot of really attractive ways to use it in your music to get rhythmic energy. And I hope that I've been able to clue you into a few composers and a few styles that could be helpful to you in what you do. And I encourage you to experiment with it. Many of you probably have already, actually, but it's really fun, and it brings a lot of pleasant energy to music that could be static otherwise. Are there any questions before we're done? You guys look like you need a nap right now. I'm not gonna lie.
I didn't get my cup of coffee before we started.
Okay, so now might be a good time to grab some caffeine. I might do that myself. But that's all I have for you today. And so I'm gonna let you go. I will see some of you in lessons in a little bit, and then we'll talk about stuff at the salon as well. Okay, thanks everyone. I will see you soon.
See ya.